So people, but we can go ahead and start. Yes, Jeff, we can start.
Okay. When do you want to make the announcements? Can you do that at the end?
Yes, I'll do that
Okay.
again.
All right. Welcome to BSA Sustainability Education Committee. Our speaker today is Christopher A. Haynes. He is Christopher A. Haynes, AIA, is an architect, urbanist, and educator in Metro Boston. After an early career in energy efficiency with a significant portion in Australia, he expanded into leading-edge sustainable design and urbanism. He has spent the last 7 years studying natural ecology and is currently writing a book on Heat Planet. And his talk today is Greenhouse Gases, True, but Not the Whole Truth. Christopher?
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to talk for a little while and tell some stories before I start the slides. It'll probably be 15 to 20 minutes before I start slides. Thank you all. Scientific projections of climate change have been growing progressively more dire since the Charney Report in 1979. Recently, 73% of Americans said they were at least generally concerned about climate change, with 39% being very concerned. I've been one of those that has been in the very concerned camp for about 30 years. But a new climate paradigm provides a path to a much better future. This paradigm says that we can reverse climate change rapidly, in months, years, or maybe decades, not centuries, at the root cause by directly addressing the cause of warming. More completely, turning down the stove is better than just removing the pot lid. And locally, where you can make a direct difference. I'm sure you are thinking, thousands of climatologists around the world have signed on the IPCC. How can there possibly be a different path? You're in very good company. Many people agree with you. But this presentation is here to address those concerns directly. This story for me began with a story about the origins of the greenhouse gas thesis. In 2015, I heard a story that goes generally like this. In 1978, the Carter administration commissioned Charles Keeling, an eminent climatologist, to write a report for the government about climate change with recommendations for policy. The report was written and submitted to the government, and it was obviously very long and complicated, but the gist of its summary said, this is a very complicated problem. Nobody will understand it. So for policy purposes, focus on greenhouse emissions. This struck me as incredibly important. I decided I really needed to find a copy of that report and see exactly what it did say. So I talked to the speaker and asked him where would I find it, and he gave me some general ideas. He said, I think if you look here and look up these keywords, I think it'll just come right up. So I did that and didn't find anything. And over the next several months, I tried a variety of different things here and there. I thought, well, I had another thought about something else that might work, and came up empty-handed. It was about a year later, I had a chance to talk to this man again. And I said I hadn't found it if he had any ideas. I think the reality is he'd read it somewhere and had no idea where. But he said, oh, look up this thing. So I tried that and it didn't work. And I kept looking at it for the course of another couple of years. I think that I saw him one more time and again asked and got some general ideas that didn't work. So I eventually went to the Boston Public Library and found a research librarian there and told her the story. And she said she didn't know, but she has access to some government documents that might be helpful. So she would run a search for me and see what she could find. And she did that and came up empty-handed and said, well, if you sign on to that computer over there, you can get access to these government documents. And maybe if you do some search yourself, you'll find something I've missed. I don't have time to do everything. So I spent a couple of hours on that computer and came up with nothing. And at this point, I was pretty hesitant to believe the story, but I really wanted to get to the bottom of it. So I decided to call the Scripps Institute in California, where the Keeling archives are. And I telephoned and spoke to a very friendly receptionist. And I told her the story and admitted I was pretty questionable about its accuracy, but I was really hoping to find the answers. And she said she didn't know, but there was a gentleman here. He was retired, but he came in periodically to help out, and maybe he could help. She would pass my request on to him. So not more than several days later, I got this extensive email with a huge amount of information, including a request that I hope this helps you, but please don't ask for any more of my time. This is all I can do. In that email, besides a lot of information, was an autobiography by Keeling, the Jason report, the Charney report, the Woodwell report, the Revell report, and a variety of other information about the Scripps Institute. This was all I needed to get started on understanding what I had been looking for. He did say that he could categorically deny that Keeling was ever commissioned by the Carter administration for a report. So I knew that story was false. But if you look at it, there's little pieces of it that may have been based on some truth somewhere. So faced with this problem, I took a architectural perspective. My favorite definition of architecture is an architect frames a problem so that a solution is possible. So I looked to try a way to frame the problem. Where specialization leads to narrow focused conclusions, as you'll see in greenhouse gases. Synthesis, weaving information together into a pattern and design, is what we do. And we collect that information from material specifications, from wall assemblies, from window details, whatever, and weave them into a pattern so that a solution is possible. Without that background, I would not have gotten to where I am today. So I was thinking in terms of some slightly different material, but my thinking process is very much as an architect. So one of the things I've looked at is a lot of physics. And I, like probably everybody here, grew up being told hot air rises. I believed that for most of my life until somewhere it was pointed out that there is no physical process that sucks hot air up. The physical formula that we understand is gravity. And gravity pulls heavy things, cold air in this case, down. So hot air does not rise. It is displaced and pushed up by falling cold air. And that distinction may sound small, but if you're trying to either produce or prevent a stratification of temperatures, getting the physics right matters in terms of providing a solution, providing a frame where the solution is possible. So the first cornerstone of this synthesis process, and critical for this paradigm change in climate science, is seeing differently. I had the honor of spending a day with Gabe Brown at a conference in January of 2018. Gabe Brown is a rancher and farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota, generally considered the coldest place in the continental US. He bought a farm from his father-in-law, which has been in the family for years, being farmed in conventional industrial agriculture fashion, which is to say the soil had been pretty well destroyed. When he got the farm, his percolation rate was 1/2 inch of water per hour. In a climate where he got about 16 inches of rain a year, that meant that a lot of what he did get ran off because it couldn't percolate into the ground. He struggled for many years. He made many mistakes. He almost went bust a couple of times. He had some very bad luck. But he finally succeeded. And when he spoke at that conference in 2018, his percolation rate was 1 inch in 9 seconds and an additional inch in 16 seconds. So 2 inches in 25 seconds is about 250 inches an hour. He was never going to lose any rain running off from a rainstorm. But one of the gems that I came out of that seminar with was a quote that he attributed to his friend Don Campbell. If you want to make small changes, you can change the way you do things. If you want to make major changes, you have to change the way you see things. And seeing differently is one of the cornerstones of this process. Now, the second cornerstone of this synthesis process is what I consider widening that perspective. There was a company who was having problem with distribution of their product. And so they did an analysis of their operations and decided that their warehouses, their loading docks, were not operating very well, but they wanted an outside view. So they hired a consultant to review the operation of their loading docks and give them recommendations on how they might address them. So the report was written with recommendations, and as is common practice in many companies, that report was given to a junior staffer. It was a good experience for the junior staffer. It saved the senior staff time of doing the review itself, and it was pretty risk-free because the junior staff would always just approve the report. So they gave it to a young engineer and asked him to review it and make recommendations and provide it to the board meeting on such and such a date. So the staffer did his work and came to the board meeting and was asked by the chairman, "Do you have a report for us today?" And he said, "Yes, sir, I do." And the staffer said, "What is your recommendation?" "With all due respect, sir, sell the warehouses." The chairman was a little bit shocked. "And what is the basis of that recommendation?" "Sir, my research indicates to me that the loading docks are a very small part of a much bigger problem in our distribution system. And getting out of the warehousing industry entirely is a much better option." This produced more than a little bit of a kerfuffle. But when the dust finally settled and people with clear heads looked at what the young man had done, he was right. So this is what is called the Eisenhower principle. Dwight Eisenhower was a brilliant strategist in World War II and asked how he succeeded in doing this. And I've seen this written slightly differently in different versions. He said, "If I ever find a problem I can't solve, I make it bigger. I will never solve it by trying to make it smaller. But if I make it big enough, I will eventually find the outline of its solution." It has been said that what he was saying was, don't get lost in the weeds. Okay. So greenhouse gases trap heat. Where does the heat come from? The answer to that question came to me in an epiphany in the fall of 2018. I have a note in my ideas file for a book title: Heat Planet, Climate Change as a Heat Island. That note records the moment I was bowled over by the realization that the physics of heat islands are the cause of climate change. Greenhouse gases exacerbate the problem, but they don't cause it. The cause is solar physics. Solar energy converts to heat if it can, whenever it strikes anything that's not vegetation. The Earth has thrived for 500 million years converting sunlight into biomass, with a portion converting into heat and a majority converting into transpiring water and causing cooling. But devegetating and developing the planet has changed the calculus. And combustion of fuels causing thermal pollution has added to the heat load. I know it was the fall of 2018 because I was scheduled to make a presentation at the Architectural Boston Exhibition, ABX, in November. I had submitted a proposal for a general talk on biodiversity, climate, and the urban environment. As I considered the implications of my Heat Planet insight, I adjusted my talk to include it while staying within the parameters I had proposed. The audience was receptive and provided very positive feedback. What stands out to me now is wondering why it took me so long and why someone with greater knowledge in climate did not see it first. I've had the distinct impression for 30 or more years that greenhouse gases were not the whole story, but I did not have an alternative explanation. I've been familiar with heat islands for about that long, but as they were so much a part of my understanding, I assumed climate scientists were also aware of them and had taken them into consideration. They have not. They dismissed them as a local effect that is irrelevant to climate, which is surprising because basic climatology knows that the atmosphere is warmed by heat radiation off the sun-warmed surface. The lapse rate, the rate at which atmospheric temperatures decrease with increasing distance from the planet's surface, confirms that. It doesn't take a lot to recognize the degree to which the Earth's surface has changed with devegetation and development, nor to notice that while the rate at which the IPC notes that warming occurs faster than they have predicted, indicating that something is missing from their models. So, I'll share my screen. Whoops. Here we go. Come on. Okay, do you see that? Hello, can you see that?
No, I'm sorry, we don't.
You don't. Well, let's try again. I'm a little confused here. Normally this works. Let's unshare that. Let's dismiss that. Sugar. Open that. And then can I share my screen? Where are we going here? With PowerPoint up. So, it's not visible?
Afraid not.
Oh. Oh, jeepers. But now I need to share the screen. I can't do both. Let's take this down. And let's put this up. Sign in. And oh, crippy. This has worked. Put it up and I can't share the screen and I take it down and you can't see it.
Chat messages here. Jeff, I got a chat messages here, so let me see if I can fix that.
You, maybe if you, can you send us the file? We can try it from here.
I've done this a million times and it's always worked, but this time it's not working. You can't see it when it's up. And I don't know why it doesn't show up when as a screen I can pick. You can't see it that way. Share the screen.
So, oh yeah, it's working now.
I see. Whoop. We just saw a directory called Stories.
Well, okay.
Is that it?
Let's share screen. Phone Stories. Okay. Let's go. Whoops, let's go. Planet. Presentations. Okay, can you see it now?
I see the directory. I don't see the presentation yet.
Can you see it now?
No, I see your directory HP-PRES.
Okay, well, I went to my directory and I opened up the file on the screen, but that doesn't work for you.
Do you see it open?
Yes, I can see it open, but if you can't, it doesn't matter.
Thank you. What if you close the directory?
Well, that's. I can try that.
Yeah, no, I'm not seeing people.
Now we're back to this. And that doesn't help. Oh, jeepers.
Open them here, present. Can you email them to us?
Screen share. I don't know what's happened here. This has worked 1,000 times. It doesn't show up in my screen for me to pick on it.
Okay, we'll send you Esther's email address, and if you, by the time you get that, if you don't see it, maybe you can just email the file and try it from here.
Okay, well, I guess we try that.
Just email it to me in the chat. Did you get it?
Pardon?
Chris, I just email you the my email address, not email, I just send you my email address over chat.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll go that route then. At
It just happened. Oh, shoot.
copy. I don't know what's going on.
I just lost the Zoom connection.
Box 2. Oh, come on. Copy. That has now failed. There's that. Copy.
Can you talk about the contents of the presentation?
I can. I'm having trouble getting this to work. My computer seems to go doing other things instead of what I'm asking for it. Okay, maybe I should just talk about it.
Yeah, we'll make the best of the situation.
Okay. Presentations. Okay, Esther, there's the file.
I don't have it yet.
Did you get that?
No, Jeff, no,
You're muted.
okay. I didn't get it.
Pardon? No. Okay. I don't know why it doesn't come up for me to pick as a file. PowerPoint goes up, share screen, and it's still not there. Share. Can you see that?
Oh, there you are.
Now you can see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
I'm sorry about that.
It happens.
Yeah, it does, unfortunately. But technology is not my strong point. All right, there's the quotes that I gave you. My title, the learning objectives. This is a photo from a neighbor's front yard in Lexington. It was 91 degrees that day, 68 degrees under the bush and 128 degrees on the road. That's a difference of 60 degrees in 30 feet. If that's not local, I don't know what is. So early climatology science. Joseph Black was an eminent chemist in Glasgow and Edinburgh. He discovered carbon dioxide and the fact that the air was a mixture of gases. He also discovered latent and specific heat, demonstrating the difference between temperature and heat. Fourier was a French physicist mathematician. He recognized that the atmosphere is warmed by infrared radiation from the Earth's surface. But he also recognized that the atmosphere must hold that heat or temperatures would drop after sunset. He did not understand the heat trapping mechanism, but he was aware of the heat trapping qualities of glass boxes and compared the atmosphere to a hothouse, just birthing the concept of a greenhouse effect. Tyndall, an Irish physicist, 1862, discovered the answer to Fourier's questions. Some atmospheric gases allow short wavelengths to pass to Earth, but prevent long wavelength rays escaping to space. Greenhouse gases are defined by high absorptivity and emissivity. The more wavelengths it absorbs, the higher its impact. Svante Arrhenius, in 1896, recognized that burning coal and petroleum products could raise the Earth's atmosphere. This was a very critical warning because it was the start of the greenhouse thesis. My wife is Australian. We moved to Australia in 1992 and stayed there 12 years. And one of the things I noticed as soon as I got there was that very small things like chapsticks are 3, 4, or 5 times more expensive in Australia than they are here. And I asked Australians about this, and they said, yes, we know that. But Australia is a very small market, which is true. And shipping, we're a long way away, and shipping is very expensive, which is also true. So we live in a wonderful country, and the fact that we pay a little bit more for some of this stuff is part of the solution. We're happy with that. Now, my interpretation of this is that because they knew the answer, they didn't ask any further questions. And the result was that this was a license for merchants to charge anything they want. They would never be challenged on price. So the greenhouse gas thesis. The modern theory of climate change is said to start with Kaiser Callender, British steam engineer, produced the artificial production of carbon dioxide and its influence on temperature in 1938. And that was really the start of where we are today. The Keeling curve, which you're all familiar with, the sawtooth pattern with a generally upbeat rise from 58 when Keeling got funding to do this research. Oops. The Jason report. In April '79, Jason's were described as a mysterious coterie of elite scientists. They wrote the long-term impact of atmospheric carbon dioxide on climate, and their status as very fancy scientists gave the report credibility. That produced quite a buzz. But the scope of the report is this. The report addresses the question of the sources of atmospheric carbon dioxide, considers distribution of the present carbon dioxide among the atmospheric, oceanic, and biospheric reservoir, and assesses the impact on climate as reflected by the average ground temperature at each latitude of significant increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's what they studied. The Charney Report. This is where the White House actually does get involved. The Carter administration looked at the Jason report and wondered if they should take seriously Gordon McDonald's prediction of climate apocalypse. So they commissioned the American Academy of Science to review the Jason report and tell them what they should do about it. And the Academy of Science chose Joel Charney, very well-respected climatologist from MIT, to lead a team and do that review. And the Charney report was almost immediately assumed as the authority of fact. But again, the scope of the report, we limited our consideration to the direct climatic effects of steadily rising atmospheric concentrations of rising CO2 increase. The IPC in 1988, the modeling became more sophisticated, but they did not change the structure. This is the IPC from 2021, the AR6. It's 3,949 pages. A friend of mine has read the entire thing cover to cover. You're welcome to do that if you'd like. Chapter 2, page 27 and 28, there's one page. Chapter 7, pages 44 to 45, there's one page. And those are the only two pages that talk about anything other than carbon dioxide. They do not mention land management or anything else. Most of that 2 pages is about albedo, which I'll discuss in a minute. They're not wrong, but it's a failure of scope. They focus solely on CO2 concentrations that did not address climate causes or other possible contributors to climate change. And all climatic changes have been interpreted as a result of increased greenhouse gas levels. Now, if you think about prairies, the central prairies of the US, just north of that is Canadian prairie provinces. Prairies tend to be fairly flat, few trees, meadow, prairie grasses, little shade, and fairly hot and dry in the summer. If you think about a prairie and think, what would it be like if that prairie suddenly dropped 3 degrees, 4 degrees? What happens if the rainfall increased by 1.5 inches or more in the summer? What happens if the humidity rose and made conditions more comfortable? Well, that's in fact exactly what happened to the Canadian prairie provinces between the 70s and the 2015. And what happened was that over that time frame, it was 40 years, farmers were individually deciding to plant more ground and leave less ground fallow. Now, fallow ground may have some weeds on it, but it isn't really growing a lot. Therefore, it's not transpiring water and it's not adding to the cooling prospect of vegetation. And over that 40 years, they dropped from 38 million acres, 15 million hectares, to about 5 million acres, it's 2 million hectares of land left fallow. And that increase in planted ground, and we're talking planted ground by standard agricultural forms, not what could be achieved with regenerative agriculture or other processes. That caused the cooling. Now, one of the points here is, yes, this was over 40 years, but had you been able to get everybody together to agree to change, the farmers together to change their processes, everything they did could have been done in 1 year. I don't have any reason to believe that it's possible to get everybody together and agree to change their processes overnight. It's not going to happen. But the point was that the physical changes made could have been done in 1 season. And it's a sociological problem of getting farmers to agree to that. Gabe Brown is a critical element in this. He's being very successful in getting people to understand the changes. So, land management, the Eisenhower principle. This is Ferrier, we mentioned before. He was the one that recognized that infrared radiation from the rising Earth's surface. It's a quote from Henson, American Meteorological Society. Therefore, planetary changes that generate heat or reduce cooling warm the atmosphere. The lapse rate I mentioned, it's the role of the Earth as the atmospheric heat source is inherent in the concept of the lapse rate, to decrease in atmospheric temperature with increasing distance from the planet's surface. Yet even where basic climatology promotes the importance of the planetary surface, the greenhouse gas proponents in the IPC have ignored it. First law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy. Energy can either be created or destroyed, but it can change form. This was discovered independently by Thomson and Clausius about 1850. Solar energy is a high-frequency electromagnetic wave, converts to different energy forms. In trees and forests, it converts to about 15% is reflected, albedo. Chemical bonds for growth, about 1%. Some is converted to heat, about 18%. The majority powers transpiration, 66%. In non-living materials, sunlight causes molecules to jiggle, which we recognize as heat. Forests and trees must be recognized as prime regulators within the water, energy, and carbon cycles. Our call to action targets a reversal of paradigm from a carbon-centric model to one that treats the hydrological and climate cooling effects of trees and Ellisons and forests as the first order of priority. That's Ellison and 22 co-authors in a journal, biology journal, in 2017. It's astounding then that while scientific publications and conferences emphasize the impact of global warming on the circulation of water in nature, almost all of them are totally silent on the influence the water cycle has on climate changes. That's Mikhail Kravchuk, a Slovakian hydrologist, who's written one of the critical books on water cycles. And this is Gabe Brown. The soil is naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever. You can experience this yourself. Now, Copernicus wrote De Revolutionis, which is his theory that the Earth rotated around the sun and not the other way around. Polemic astronomers had been trying to prove for 1,500 years that the sun rotated around the Earth. But in order to make that fit with their observations of exactly what the planetary conditions were, they had come up with a huge number of ridiculous mathematical solutions with models of planets running within systems, but running within systems, and never came up with anything particular, but they were convinced that the sun rotated around the Earth. Copernicus was a brilliant mathematician and recognized that if he struck all of those variations out, he could create a very simple, mathematically elegant model that demonstrated exactly how the planets move to each other, rotating around the sun. He appears to have written his book perhaps as early as 1509. It looks as if he had shared at least the manuscript with some of his closest allies about 1512 to 1513, but he refused to publish the book. He recognized that his theory was much too radical and it would destroy his reputation. So he held off. The book was published in 1543, the year of his death. There's a story that says the first copy of the book came off the presses and was presented to him on his deathbed. He got a chance to look at it and smile with his life work in his hands, and he died quietly. Nobody knows if that story is true. But the scientific community, that is the community of people that look at the facts and rationally evaluate the truth out of that, took 150 years and the influence of Johannes Kepler before they finally accepted that Copernicus was right. Okay. Enter the built environment. This is Luke Howard, an Englishman. As a child, Howard was fascinated by weather and the climate. He spent hours just watching the sky and the clouds. In an evening in February in 1802, he walked onto the stage of the Scythian Society, which is a science club in London, and gave a presentation called The Transformation of Clouds. An hour later, he walked into history, having developed the cloud classification system that we still use today. Goethe wrote poetry in his praise. With several years of data of heat measurements, temperature measurements in and around London, in 1818, he published The Climate of London in first volume. In 1820, he published the second volume. He was the first to discover and analyze urban heat islands. It is probable, therefore, that the sun in summer actually warms the air of the city more than it does that of the country around. And a modern definition from Garland, 2011, defines heat islands as where air and surface temperatures are hotter than the rural surroundings. Now, this quote out of Howard is taken a little bit out of context, and it doesn't really talk only about summer, but it appears so from here. This is Garland. Causes of heat islands: decreased evaporation, increased heat storage, increased heat capture, decreased convection, anthropogenic heat, systemic interactions. You could take that almost directly out of Howard. We've learned amazingly little in 200 years. Now, this is out of Kravchuk's book. It's a plaza in Czechoslovakia, but that's not too relevant. It's a thermal image. As you can see, the roof of the building are probably closing 100 degrees. The facades in the plaza themselves are quite warm, and the trees in the background are quite cool. Now, there's a city or town in Italy with a plaza. It's not too surprising. There are lots of cities, lots of plazas in cities in Italy. The thing about this plaza is it's incredibly cool in the summer. Everybody comes out to sit in the plaza in the summer evenings to enjoy the fact that it's a cool plaza. The question is, why is it so cool? Any thoughts? It has to do with what happens to it during the day. Would you say it's A, nothing special, B, children's programs, C, a market, or D, a parking lot? No takers. The answer is a parking lot. And the significance of that is that the cars shade the paving, not entirely, obviously, but mostly. The cars get very hot, and people come out of work, get into their cars, and drive the heat out of the plaza. The result is the evening It's very cool. It hasn't had a chance to warm up all day. Urbanism has grown dramatically for the last few hundred years. Since 1800 and 2000, greenhouse gases have risen from 282 to 369 parts per million. It's an increase of 30.85%. Urban areas, urban footprints, have increased more than 100-fold, 100 times that, at 3,300%, and urban populations more than that at 3,800%. And those are urban footprints. As you well know, the surface area of a city is far beyond its footprint. Build a one-story house, 1,800 square feet, the walls are approximately the same as the roof, which you've doubled the surface area of the site. A 5-story commercial building, and the walls are roughly 4 times the roof. And for a 50-story commercial building, the walls are roughly 20 times the roof. Now, yes, the northern side in the northern hemisphere is shaded, and tall buildings shade each other, so not all of that surface gets hot all the time. But the surface area of a city is well beyond maybe 5 or 10 times the footprint. And that's the area that's being heated by the sun. Howard calculated a mean annual temperature difference of 1.57 degrees between London and surrounding areas. Today, heat islands are typically 1 to 5 centigrade or 2 to 9 Fahrenheit above surrounding areas. With documented cases of at least 20, well, I actually have a case of 26 came out of a doctoral dissertation. 26 degrees. That's a pretty significant change of how warm the cities get. Albedo, I said I'd mention that. I assume most of you are familiar with albedo. It measures how much energy is reflected. It tells you nothing about what happens to the energy that is not reflected. That matters. The albedo of a forest is 15%. The albedo of a brick is also 15%. I showed you what happens to energy striking a forest, with 2/3 of that energy causing cooling by transporting water. In a brick, the 85% that is not reflected is turned totally into heat. An urban area has an albedo of about 20, a little bit more than a brick, but 80% of that energy turns directly into heat, which is the source of an urban heat island. Albedo is completely invalid as a measure of heat generation, but that's what the IPC and all the climatologists use. I'm baffled as to why. So heat island physics. Everywhere the sun shines. This has 2 implications. We underestimate heat island's temperature increase because we have net 0 point to measure against, which means that the other areas are also increased in heat temperature, not necessarily to the same extent, but if your non-urban area is up 2 degrees, then you're underestimating the urban heat island by 2 degrees. And the heat generation is not limited to the world's built environment. It means all of the open areas are also generating heat, not as much as a city, but there's a lot more of them. Hundreds of millions of acres of bare ground in agriculture, deforestation, aridification, wildfires, receding glaciers, open pit mining, and mountaintop removal. Millions of miles of roadways, paving, and parking lots. That's about 4 million miles in the continental US. And vast expanses of housing and other buildings also generating heat and solar energy. I propose that the root cause of warming the planet is the generation of heat, the destruction of natural vegetation, solar energy converted to heat in bare soils and abiotic materials, and vast energy consumption in forest fires generating thermal pollution. Greenhouse gases exacerbate this warming, but do not cause it. So, while greenhouse gas science ignored land management and climatology mismeasured heat generation from the planet's surface, we created a global heat island, a heat planet. I'm sorry for having had time getting lost in getting this screen share. I have about 15 minutes of slides, or I would at least like to show one more if we don't want to do those 15 minutes. Or if you want to open it up to discussions, I'll show the one slide and then we can move on. That's up to you.
I think you should show your slide.
You think so? Just the one slide?
All the slides, all the slides.
Want to see all of them? Yeah, I mean, some people will stay. I'll stay.
Okay. I can go through a lot of this fairly quickly. Okay, this is what I talked about earlier. We have opportunity to resolve overheating, root cause completely, locally, and rapidly. The root cause is sunlight into heat and thermal pollution. And less heat generation reduces the trapped heat and therefore the greenhouse effect. We reduce the generation heat, we reduce the amount that's trapped and reflected. So the whole effect is a reduction. You know all of these pictures. This is what we're doing with sunlight. In case you can't see it, that's Detroit, Chicago, Indianapolis, and St. Louis. That's a thermal image of a heat island. The lower right is moisture over the Amazon. The upper left is Dixie Creek in Nevada. I'll show you that in a few minutes. About 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit in a combustion chamber of an internal combustion engine. And all of that heat dissipates. Eliminating the source, turning on a stove is more effective than removing the pot lid. Locally, the picture I showed you on the right of the local front lawn. Canberra, Australia, is 12.6 degrees Fahrenheit cooling than urban areas 2 miles away. This is a city of 400,000. It's very flowery, lots and lots of grass and green. It's not a walkable city and it's got lots of problems. If we have heat islands, we can have cool islands, and you're looking at one of them in an oasis. It's a cool vegetation in a desert environment. Depaving, shading, and resurfacing reduces heat generation tomorrow. Covering bare soil with crops or cover crops reduces heating and increases cooling in weeks or months. Trees and forests will reduce heating and increase cooling within a decade. We have lots of opportunities. This is Crabcheck. There are 2 water cycles. The large water cycle transports water around the globe horizontally. Small water cycles are vertical. They work within watersheds. This shows 2 small water cycles on a slope, and that's an error. It would never happen. They only fit within one watershed. But if you take water out of a small water cycle, you decrease the water in that water cycle. And if you look at where humans have lived for the last 8,000 or 10,000 years, most of it is desert. Northern Africa, where I am now, was a breadbasket of Rome. And it's not a breadbasket anymore. On the right, you see a moist environment with 70 to 80% of the energy being converted to latent heat, 5 to 10 being converted to sensible heat. On the left, you see a drained field without the water, and 60 to 70 is turned into sensible heat, 10 to 20 into evapotranspiration. This is the heat dome. It's just an image of the high pressure that provides as temperature heats up and rises over the city. And the result of that is a redistribution of rain. That high pressure over the city acts as a buffer, an umbrella over the city that deflects rain. And it's been documented where rain has been decreased in the lowlands where the cities are and increased in the higher altitudes because of the deflection of the rain clouds over the city heat domes. Recharging groundwater. You know all of this pretty well. It gets pretty difficult when everything's paved. This is Crabcheck. Reusing the small water cycle to regenerate aridified, desertified areas. And it's an example of how this happens. And this is the second stage. You just work it very slowly, and it can be done by simply making sure that all the water stays where it falls and doesn't run off and get diverted into this ocean. This is Dixie Creek, Nevada, I just showed you. Now, this is a farm. This is actually owned by Griggs. Can't think of his first name. John Griggs. He was being consulted by Carol Evans from the Bureau of Land Management. This is grazing practices. And all they did not stop their grazing. They did not reduce the number of cows they had. They changed the parameters of how they grazed the land. And this is 21 years. But between those two pictures, this is the same area, reducing the same number of cattle, just being done differently. This is Gabe Brown, his basic 5 principles of regenerative ag. No mechanical disturbance, no plowing using no-till methods, armor on the soil, protecting the soil with crops or stubble to prevent it from getting overheated and eroded, increasing biodiversity, living roots in the soil as long as possible. He's keeping plants growing most of all year long in a climate that gets to 40 below zero in the winter. And the animal infrastructure that integrates this whole system. Armor on the soil, covering the soil. I won't go into the details, but this is areas of cotton, soybeans, and corn over the area. These rows are generally 2 feet apart, which leaves an awful lot of bare ground. I'll show you that in a second. This is the one slide I wanted to make sure you saw. This is a piece of the Keeling curve between the October 2017 and October 2018. As you can see, it's dominated by the Northern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere has a much greater land area than the Southern Hemisphere, and so it dominates the photosynthesis cycle. In October, which is basically the end of the growing season, greenhouse gases start to accumulate and rise. Now they rise until the end of May or early June. You can see that peak at about 412 parts per million. And with the growing season starting, they start to fall. Now, as you can see, they bottom again about October. They bottom at about 1.5 parts per million above where they started the year before. But what do we need to change to make sure that that bottom is lower than it started, not higher than it started? Architects frame a problem so that a solution is possible. Look at that and think about, how do you make a solution possible? Yes, Esther.
Sorry.
I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yes. It was a glitch. No, I was just trying to fix things. Jeff, can you tell Chris that it was just a glitch? I was trying to fix some technical issues.
Oh,
I can't really hear you very well. You say you're muted from my perspective, but I can hear you a little bit.
Esther was just trying to fix something. Not trying to answer the question.
Sorry, Jeff. Sorry, Chris. I muted myself because I don't want echo. There might be echo problems. So
Okay. Well, I would propose that the answer to that question is that we need a lot more photosynthesis. Now, we think of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as being enormous, and they are. But the other side of that is that we turn that over about every 3 years. We take out about 1/3 of the total greenhouse in the atmosphere every year, and then resubmit it. So if we simply increase the amount of photosynthesis that was available, we would reduce that. Now, yes, we would also reduce it by reducing the emissions we're adding, which are significant, and I'm not saying they're not. But I'm proposing that the doable solution is to just make sure we increase the photosynthesis, and that is doable. Okay, bare soil. Upper left, this is our addiction to annual crops that produces plowing, which is a bad cross position. The lower left is that cornfield. As I said, those crops, those rows are about 2 feet apart. So even when they're growing crops, they're leaving lots of bare soil. Gabe Brown's solution is to add cover crops between the soil, and some people will say that doesn't work, but he's demonstrated that it has. The sand dunes and the erosion gullies are another problem, but all of that bare soil is just producing heat. And anything that can be done to change that would make a difference in our climate. Deforestation, this is about 10 or 12 million acres a year that we're losing to deforestation. Desertification, if anybody knows that picture, it's many miles from the coast. That used to be the lake. Environmental destruction. This is mountaintop removal in West Virginia. That insert on the upper left gives you a sense of the scale of this, but that is all land that is basically doing nothing but generating heat. Environmental pollution, this is Queenstown, Tasmania. In 1888, Queenstown found a silver stream and they started mining it. Silver rarely appears by itself as a metal, so it's very difficult to mine. And in 1892, they found a copper mine, a copper stream that was much richer. So they switched to mining copper. Unfortunately, that copper was very heavily polluted with sulfur. And when they smelted the copper ore, they produced what was effectively sulfuric acid. And it totally defoliated the entire valley. I was there in 1994, basically 100 years after they started mining copper. And it was still a moonscape. It was absolutely incredible to see nothing growing. This is the VIX study that I mentioned earlier. Summer temperature drop of 3.6 degrees, rainfall increase of 40 milliliters, and a reduced thermal temperatures. So that's what I have for you. If there are any questions, comments, or snide remarks, I'm open to those.
I have always found this interesting. We've talked about it in years past. Can you go over the definition of albedo?
Albedo is reflection. It is the amount of energy that is reflected. Heat is not reflected. Heat is transported by conduction, convection, and radiation. But energy can be reflected, and it's reflected out at the same wavelength that it came in at. So the Earth sheds solar energy coming in by reflecting it back to space. And there are there's a window of wavelengths that are particularly effective in reflecting energy out. Some people are working on various coatings that will be very effective in reflecting heat out, energy out. I contend that it's actually far better to use that energy in photosynthesis and then to radiate it out than it is to reflect it away initially. We lose the value that that energy can provide to us in growth and in cooling. But reflection seems easy and technical, so people are focusing on it. But as I said, albedo tells you nothing about what happens to the energy that's not reflected. And so it's a very incomplete definition of the heat issues in the environment.
Does it refer to total electromagnetic energy?
Pardon?
When you say it's a measure of energy, much energy gets reflected? Is that that include the full spectrum of energy from the sun?
Yes and no. Basically, it does. However, there are certain wavelengths that are reflected less completely than others. So I'm sure that what is actually reflected is a slightly biased sample of what came in. I can't give you all the details of exactly where those were. We do get some small amount of heat from the sun in long wave radiation, but not very much because of the temperature of the sun. The wavelengths that are emitted are a result of the fourth power of the temperature. So that produces a very shortwave radiation, high frequency shortwave radiation that is reflected back. Is that what you needed, Jeff?
Yeah, I think of it in terms of light, because that's
Well,
my specialty. But
sure.
I wanted to know what the full definition.
The central, the peak wavelength generated by the sun is a wavelength in the middle of the green spectrum. There is more light generated in that wavelength than any other, and there's less energy on both sides of it. So your visible spectrum is by far the largest percentage of energy radiated from the sun. We have a small amount of infrared on the one hand and an ultraviolet on the other. But your major wavelengths are in the visible light spectrum.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Excuse me, I've got a question, if I may.
Sure.
Christopher, first, very interesting, very stimulating observations here. Do you have any thoughts at this point in the context of, to the extent that architects are currently focused on electrification, decarbonization as the main strategies for dealing with climate change, and your point being that all of that may be peripheral to the real forces at play. Do you have any suggestions about what architecture is presently practiced, what architects is presently practicing might do in light of these observations?
That's a pretty difficult question, because if we go back to fundamentals, my proposition is that the problem is the generation of heat. So what can we do to reduce the generation of heat? First off, we can reduce the amount of heat that is created from solar energy. Very honestly, that is a matter of agriculture and forestry. There are hundreds of millions of acres of land in agriculture that could be turned into regenerative processes that would drastically reduce the heat generated and actually be a win-win-win for the farmers involved. If we did that properly, and Gabe Brown is certainly working on trying to do that, I think we would reduce the temperature so significantly that it's even possible we wouldn't have to worry about the cities. I started this thinking in terms of cities, and the farther I got into it, the more I realized that cities, there's 136,000 square miles of cities in 2000. And I haven't got UN figures since then. They probably exist and I haven't found them. And I know that China and India have been producing cities at a rapid rate since then. But that's a small drop in the bucket compared to the amount of land out there that's generating heat from bare soil. And if we could address the agriculture and the forestry problems, if we could completely cease all deforestation. And I know that sounds pretty drastic, but particularly in rainforests, it's critical. That would matter. Maybe if architects cease to be a customer for some of those wood products from deforestation, that would help, but that's a pretty big ask, and I'm not sure exactly how you do it. But in the cities, I think your best colleagues are your landscape architects. How do you come up with as little paving as possible? How do you eliminate paving that exists? What can you do with green roofs and green walls and living walls? Just in terms of buildings themselves, the greatest insulation you can do is exterior. This runs into all sorts of problems, and I know that. But can you insulate the exterior of buildings and put an exterior cover on it that has minimal thermal capacity? In smaller buildings, I think of 15th century English architecture. Buildings were wood frame with rubble walls and covered in plaster. If you insulated everything with an appropriate level of exterior insulation and then stuccoed the whole thing with a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch of stucco, instead of having 4 inches of concrete, you'd have 3/4 of an inch of stucco that would get warm. Now you've made a massive reduction. You've also increased the potential energy efficiency of the building as an energy consumer. So I think that there's perhaps a win-win-win in reducing energy heat production in that form. I have played with the idea, and I don't have all the details, but if we were to clad buildings in PV panels, they would generate heat. I mean, aluminum and glass are fairly high heat capacity, and we'd be putting a lot of it on it. However, if our buildings generate heat anyway, if we were to clad them in PV, they could replace heat generation in other forms. Maybe our cities become our energy producers, and we could turn off all the other forms of energy generation that we use. Maybe that works. I don't know. Other than that, I think that living buildings and living walls and green roofs are certainly a place to look. But this is not easy. I mean, there's also simple shading systems of preventing the sun from getting onto paving with shading systems. I see a lot of that here in Morocco. Simple cloth fabrics that shade the roof, the floor areas, so that people are walking around in very pleasant conditions. It hasn't been particularly hot here in the winter, but it gets quite hot in the summer. So shading matters. If you could heat up a piece of fabric, doesn't store or hold very much heat, but in a result, produce a shade that prevents paving that does hold a lot of heat from getting hot, that would be a step in the right direction. This is all very preliminary thinking, and how you apply it in any given state is not easy. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that this is in fact what's causing our problem, and we have to address it. And it's going to be difficult, but we have to do it. I don't know if that helps your answer or not.
Thank you. As you say, it's not obvious what we can do as architects, especially in cities. I observe, for example, that when you create sunscreens, you're also increasing the surface area. Although you're solving a problem on the interior of a building, you may be exacerbating a problem on the outside. But PV panels and things of that sort would convert energy to electricity that's a usable form and displaces others. It certainly makes sense.
Yeah, I think that there's a place for that. I think there's a place for lots of different solutions, and weaving those together in a pattern is the only answer I've got at the moment. And the details of that are very elusive. I'm not saying this is an easy problem. I'm just saying that this is in fact the problem we're facing. And we need to find ways of thinking about it differently, expanding our viewpoint and looking at a wider perspective of how to do this. All electricity produces heat. It all turns into heat one way or another. So, for example, wind is a cooling force. But if you put a wind turbine up there, you take that cooling force and turn it into electricity. You also disrupt the movement of the cooling force in eddies and such from around the wind turbine. You then turn that cooling force into electricity, which generates heat. So I understand the problem with trying to avoid fossil fuels, but you're may not be helping. I don't know. I can't make an edict that says wind turbines are bad, but I can see the physics where we're turning something that is causing cooling into something that's causing heating. Maybe that's not the right direction. Wind panel, PV panels get hot. But if we could get them hot, generating electricity for our cities, and as a result, drastically reduce the energy that is creating heat outside of our cities or within our cities in terms of other forms of generation, maybe that's a balance that actually makes a sense.
Thank you.
Okay. I should stop the share.
Okay, well, this is great, Chris. Thank you very much. And that was a great discussion. If we have no further questions, I think we'll end the meeting. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
And thank you especially for participating from halfway around the globe, sounds like.
Well, that's where I am till my wife's sabbatical finishes.
Wonderful. Okay, well, take care. I think you defined your next problem as what is the true advantage of renewable energy, the renewable energy techniques that we're currently using.
Well, I've walked into a bit of a hornet's nest trying to sell this one. I'm not sure if I want to walk into that one too.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
And we hope to see you in person when you return.
I will be back in probably mid-May. Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. Take care now. Bye now.